Hello, everybody. I'm interviewing today Dr. Colin Brewer, who at this moment is in London, and I am in San Diego. So this is a great technical feat. I am particularly interested in having him talk about his, I think, wonderful book, which I can't get in the screen because I've put the wrong background in. You don't happen to have a copy, Colin, do you?
Amazing to tell. I do have.
There it is.
Yes.
Oh, let me not get Alzheimer's, sweet heaven. I love the title. How did you come up with a title like that? And that, of course, is a picture of an Alzheimer's brain.
Yeah.
Yes. So you've been in this movement as long, if not longer than I have, which is over 33 years.
Yes. Well, more than that. I joined the old Voluntary Euthanasia Society in 1978. So,
oh my gosh,
a good 42 years, and I wrote a few articles in support of it before then in the 1970s, which was how I got invited to join them in the first place.
So you knew Derek Humphrey from that organization?
Yeah, I knew Derek.
For the information of people who don't know who Derek Humphrey is, Derek was the founder of the Hemlock Society, National Hemlock Society in 1980. I am with the Hemlock Society of San Diego, which was one of the chapters of the National Hemlock Society, and the only remaining residual Hemlock Society I think there is, maybe in the world, I don't know. But we try to keep on Derek's tradition of providing information to people about all aspects of end of life, whether it's acceptable to them or not, but people should know, we think, what their options are.
My main claim to fame, I suppose, is I think I was the first to suggest when I joined the committee of the society that since it was, I thought, unlikely that we would get legislation for quite a long time, that we ought to produce for members of the society a little booklet explaining how they could commit suicide, rational suicide, that it was only for members of the society. You had to be a member for 3 months before you could get it. And of course, in those pre-internet days, that meant that essentially it was restricted to members of the society. So even before Derek hit on the clever idea of writing a novel that gave it all away, or a sort of account of his wife's illness and death, we were starting on it. We got slightly blocked by some old-fashioned members who didn't like the idea. So we gave it to the Scots, who had because the law in Scotland is slightly different, a little bit like state laws in America. So they were able to produce it theirs a little bit before we did. But around about 1980, that's when the first do-it-yourself guides came out. I think they're a bit of a collector's item now.
I was going to say, I thought Derek's book, Final Exit, which came out in 1991, was the first manual, but now you're telling me that there was one much earlier.
Yep. Well, he wrote a thing called Jean's Way.
Yes, Jean's Way. Yeah.
It was about his wife, his first wife, and that had enough information, sort of page 33, she ground up, 35.3 200 milligram tablets of whatever it was and drank it down. So that, and he wasn't prosecuted for that.
No.
Even though we strongly suggested to the government that if they didn't think it was illegal, they should either put up or shut up, but they managed to wriggle out of that.
He wasn't the first person to write about helping someone die. Betty Rolland did too, writing about her mother's death, and she was never questioned at all. Derek was questioned, but was dropped, I guess, very quickly.
Well, I think the authorities realize the more fuss they make, the more it simply spreads the word. So on the whole, they tend not to do it unless their hand is forced.
And then he wrote another book, Let Me Die Before I Wake, which was also a thinly disguised manual for self-deliverance. And I think the need for that has not gone away.
No, absolutely not.
No.
Of course, Exit International now provides very detailed and rather ingenious ways of ending your life, and is very high tech. And they also hold very jolly little seminars, which people meet and have tea and coffee and cakes. We were the board of My Death, My Decision, which is the more radical of the two British end-of-life societies south of the border. Scotland has its own. They were reluctant to put a direct link to Exit International, but we just put a link to an article in the Spectator magazine, which described a meeting, and so it's quite clear that if people want to take that further, they can do so.
Were you at that meeting, Colin? Sorry to get so.
Yeah, I've been to a couple of. I know Philip quite well, and I think possibly I share one of Philip's views, which is that all doctors know how to end their lives if they have to,
Right?
And it's a great comfort, and I don't see why our patients shouldn't have the same privilege. That's always been my position.
I just wrote a paper on do we need a middleman, and that's very controversial. We still need a do-it-yourself sort of thing because the middleman process doesn't include everybody.
No, and I think that one of the big debates at the moment is whether people should have to take medication themselves or whether they'd rather have a doctor do it. And all the evidence so far is that the large majority of people would much rather they had a doctor running the show than having to do it themselves for various reasons, but mainly because they want to be sure that it really will work and that they haven't taken insufficient. And it's also a lot quicker if a doctor does it, so people don't have to hang around for maybe an hour waiting for someone to stop breathing, which can easily happen. Sometimes it takes more than that.
When you say does it, you mean provide a lethal injection to the person?
Yes, yeah. I mean, because a doctor can you not only give a powerful sedative, which puts people deeply unconscious, but if that's all you did, they'd carry on breathing. But if you then, once they're unconscious, stop the breathing with another drug, then the breathing stops, and 5 or 10 minutes later, the heartbeat stops too. But if you just swallow a big dose of barbiturates, yes, you'll go unconscious, usually within 3 minutes, but then you carry on breathing, usually for another 20 minutes or so. And sometimes that can be rather distressing to watching family members, especially if they don't realize that the fact that someone's still breathing doesn't mean that they're suffering. So in Canada, literally 99.9% of people, where they have the choice, choose doctor administered. And in Belgium, the figure's about 85%, and I think it will be higher easily.
Let's talk about Alzheimer's. I think your little book is one of the best books on the subject that I've read. It's wonderful. I highly endorse it because it's fairly recent. You wrote it in 2019.
Yes, it's currently only available as a Kindle. I don't know how long it'll be before we can get books out, but I'm talking to people about a Spanish edition and a German edition. Someone said there are more Spanish speakers in the world than English speakers. I'm not sure that's true, but
now Chinese, so
yeah.
You should think about that. I think I got this on Amazon, and I thought it was quite inexpensive, like $3 or something. It's the best $3 I've ever spent because it's what happens that your views agree with mine, but also there's so much to learn in this book. So that's a plug for the book. I stand by that. It's excellent. So let's talk about some of the solutions that you talk about at the end of the book. Well, let's talk about first what you think about Alzheimer's and dementias and if it happened to you, how you might be thinking about it.
Well, unless I were to change my mind subsequently, I think that if I were diagnosed with early Alzheimer's, I would make quite sure I had enough medication to end my life, which I already do, like many doctors. And when I thought things had gone far enough and I didn't want to risk it losing capacity, I would invite a few people round, have a party, and say goodbye. And that would be it. And it would also mean that I could invite people from a few people who lived far away if they wanted to come. I suppose these days you can do it all by Zoom anyway.
All by Zoom, yes. Please invite me.
Yeah, and they could come, and if they wanted, the funeral could be, in theory, could be, if it was in Switzerland, you could, of course, arrange for a funeral and cremation the next day. In Britain, I think it would be regarded as a suicide, so there would have to be an inquest. So the funeral probably wouldn't be able to take place for at least a few days until the coroner had released it. I hadn't really thought of that, but that'd be something for my friends and relations to sort out.
You have two advantages, really. Well, you haven't talked about, you just alluded to Switzerland, but you're likely to go to Switzerland.
Oh, I think I would do it. I wouldn't bother going to Switzerland. I'd do it here.
Yes. But you're a doctor and you have access to the medication. And if you weren't, and you're a Brit and you're not very far from Zurich or wherever you would go in Switzerland, that's another alternative for you.
I wouldn't go to Switzerland, or I might try, if I were not a medic, I might try and get some barbiturate on the internet, which is not too difficult. You have to make sure that it really is barbiturate, but it's not difficult to buy it. The current place to get it is from Peru, I believe.
That's what Philip says, yes.
But you can get these things, and I mean, when I was making sure I had enough medication, a doctor could write a prescription for himself, and nobody batted an eyelid as long as you didn't do it every week.
Things have gotten worse, I think.
Indeed.
More stringent, yes.
Although I was talking, the last time I was in the States, I was talking to, I think I mentioned it in the book, quite a distinguished American physician who had just been diagnosed with early dementia. And I had lunch with him and his wife, and he said, of course, I'm not going to wait till it gets very bad. I'll write a prescription in my wife's maiden name and get the medication. In fact, it worked out rather well, because he went on a final holiday to Greece, had a heart attack and died there. So
that's convenient, yes.
That's as good as it gets. Yes.
I don't think we even have access to barbiturates here anymore. We use a different formula, but that's a whole nother story. And also we have an organization here that you don't have there, that not as many people know about as they should, called Final Exit Network. And they will instruct people with early dementia on the best way to die, which is actually the inhalation of an inert gas. Yeah. So no medications required.
I think I saw a video about them helping someone in Oregon or somewhere like that, or maybe in Canada.
No, neither one. I think Oregon is probably not hospitable to the Final Exit Network, because that's where the Oregon model started, and Final Exit Network doesn't go to Canada. So it would be somebody in the United States, I think the continental United States only. But anyway, those are the alternatives we have. And V said, maybe we better back up here and talk about this book, and at what stages, and why would somebody with Alzheimer's want to end their life? And if not, what their other choices would be.
Well, of course, the other choice is just to, since there is no treatment and no sign of any treatment in the foreseeable future, given that for most people after diagnosis, it's probably only going to be 2 or 3 years before they get into the stage when they're losing capacity. It can be a bit earlier, it can be a bit later. But you have to, the ideal thing is to have thought about this very carefully when you're a bit younger, come to a conclusion, put it in your living will, make sure that everybody knows about it. And then, for example, if you were admitted to hospital with something like COVID, in a case of early dementia, you could make it clear that you did not want any treatment. And if you died of COVID, that would be actually quite a good outcome. It's interesting that I got a letter signed by our 5 prominent medical patrons saying that if we had dementia and we got COVID, we would emphatically not want to be resuscitated. And we couldn't get it into any of the major papers, but we managed to get it into the British Medical Journal. But they gave it such a bland and unmemorable headline that I don't think anybody noticed it.
Well, I'm interested. Send me the copy.
But that would certainly be one of the things I would make clear. I mean, everybody knows my views, so all my nearest and dearest know exactly how I feel. But I think everybody else who wants to think about this at all, which is probably no more than 10 or 20% of the population, because most people really don't like thinking about death and hope that somehow it won't happen to them, or that they'll be in Philadelphia instead or whatever. But I think you need to document your wishes, make sure that your family doctor knows about it. And then if you are getting to the stage where you think that the dementia is really going to rob you of your capacity, or it's already taking so much of your quality of life that you don't want to continue, then you make arrangements and you either go to Switzerland or you have to do something on your own. And of course, a lot of people, particularly if they're not do-it-yourself enthusiasts, are a bit unhappy about that. They're a bit reluctant. I think women particularly, rather like women don't like violent methods of suicide. I'm talking about ordinary and impulsive suicide. Women very rarely used to hang themselves, for example, and they virtually never use car exhaust, because I'm afraid it's still true that most women don't know one end of a car exhaust from another. No doubt that is changing, but it's not something that they felt comfortable with, whereas a man used to more mechanical things might feel happier with that. So there are important cultural differences here.
I'd like to make a distinction. This does not have to do with your book, but between COVID and Alzheimer's, the chances of recovering from COVID, maybe with some sequelae, but are pretty good.
Well, it depends on your age. Yeah,
your underlying condition and all that kind of thing. But most people recover, and from Alzheimer's is a downward slope from which you don't recover, you just get worse. And I think that's quite a different thing. So I would not have a DNR for COVID, but I certainly would for dementia.
Oh, I agree. Yes, I mean, if I didn't have Alzheimer's, I would take my chances. I might say that if I got a cardiac arrest, I'm not sure that because the older you get, the less likely a cardiac arrest is to work, and the more likely you are to end up with serious brain damage.
Right.
But yes, I would certainly tell them to make every effort if it looked as if things were going well. But if I had early dementia, I would not. Right.
And V said, voluntary stopping eating and drinking if you have early dementia.
Well, that's open to anyone, of course. I've discovered that in Britain, it seems not to be regarded as suicide. I don't know whether you ever met Jean Davis in the
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Well, she quite publicly said she was going to die by stopping eating and drinking, but she didn't actually stop drinking. She stopped eating, but for some reason, I don't know whether she just wanted to prolong it a bit. I certainly had a farewell telephone call with her, and she sounded quite cheerful. But it took her longer to die than she'd expected. I think it took 2 to 3 weeks. But but her family doctor had agreed, even though he apparently identified himself as Christian, which in Britain is a bit unusual, not in America.
Oh, really?
Only 2% of the Church of England, I read today, actually goes to church regularly. I mean, Britain is completely different from America. Religion is not prominent in life, and the idea that you couldn't elect someone because they didn't believe in God would be regarded as absurd by most people, whereas in America, I think that's still a bit of a bar. Sorry, I've lost the thread a little. I've obviously got early Alzheimer's.
Well, VSED, we're talking about
yeah,
VSED.
that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
He was willing to give her some sedation, and so she was able to get a decent night's sleep. And I suggested that a doctor, I can't remember whether I mentioned it in the book, but it was something I was only working on more recently, but it would be, because COVID is not, because VSED is not regarded as suicide, if a doctor were to assist someone by keeping them generously sedated, but not dangerously sedated, just so that they were asleep most of the time, but you could wake them if you gave them a firm shake. You could keep someone asleep for the 4 or 5 days that it would need for the average, particularly frail person, to die from complete dehydration. Because if you just stop eating, it can take 2 months to die. But if you stop drinking, it's days, not even weeks as a rule. So you could keep someone sedated so that they were asleep for most of the time. And if I'm right, then it would be impossible to prosecute them for assisting a suicide, because what they're assisting is not suicide. But I've been trying to get a decision out of the chief law officer, and you can imagine what that's like. I mean, anything but an answer.
No, I think in our case, in the States, we'd have to go to court. Somebody would have to be prosecuted. I've never heard of any doctor being prosecuted for speeding along the VSED process.
I mean, I've been trying to collect death certificates from cases where I either know or I strongly suspect that someone has died either by VSED or by suicide, even though it didn't appear in the obituary. And definitely one case where I'm as certain as I can be that he took an overdose. It was not reported because nobody mentioned it to the coroner, and he was suffering from fairly terminal cancer anyway. So you don't even, if death is expected, you don't have to inform the coroner. There is no inquest. So I'm trying to do this with VSED as well.
Oh, good, yeah, but don't call attention to it because it's still under the radar, I think.
But certainly in Jean Davies' case, I got the death certificate, and there was no mention of VSED, even though she made it very clear that that's what she was doing.
I think Boudouin Chabot did a study on cases in Switzerland, in Holland.
Did he?
Died from VSED. Yeah, I think.
I must know that. I don't know that one.
But the better thing, and I think this is what happens now in Belgium and Holland, is to have an advance directive saying that you want euthanasia if you reach a certain point in your dementia.
Yeah.
And what do you know about that, Colin?
Well, it certainly happens. It's only possible in Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg. You can't do it in Switzerland because you have to have capacity and consent at the time you see the doctor for the final interview. I don't think you can't do it in. You can't do it, as far as I know, in Canada, and certainly not in the States.
Not yet in Canada. They're aiming for that. They hope by January to have it. Yeah.
But it's not available yet, I think. But in that, I think, is what most people would want. I mean, in the book, I quoted a British survey in which people ordinary citizens were asked what they would like if they to be done with them if they were in hospital with dementia, fairly advanced dementia, not end state dementia, but clearly having not being able to recognize the family and hardly have a conversation, but perhaps 2 or 3 years away from actually dying. What would they like to happen if they got pneumonia or a heart attack? And nearly all of them said, I definitely do not want to be resuscitated. The only group of people who did not feel that were the relatively small number of Black and Asian patients who almost certainly were much more religious. Because in both Britain and America, Blacks tend to be more religious than whites. And many of the Asians, not all, are Muslim, and Islam is absolutely dead against assisted dying, as of course Christianity used to be, but is now less so. So most indigenous white Brits would not want to be kept alive, and I think quite a lot of them would, if it were possible, to have a lethal injection when they got to a certain point. I think quite a lot of them wouldn't mind. In fact, the research actually said that. It said most of them were actually in favor of euthanasia at that stage. So we know that's what a lot of people want, but I think it's going to be a long time before a legislature delivers it. But I see all right to die legislation as a process. I think the important thing is to get at least something for the terminally ill, if possible to get something for the chronically and progressively ill as well. And then I think once people get used to it, what our enemies regard as a terrible slippery slope, but what I regard as a perfectly normal state of affairs, once people have got used to something, they think, actually, it's not such a terrible idea, and we ought to think perhaps of extending it modestly in various directions. I mean, that's what happens with all new ideas in society. At first, only a few people take them up. And then gradually, if they seem to be good ideas, more and more people take them up until it becomes perfectly normal.
Do you know anything about how that's working out in the Benelux countries as far as having an advanced directive for euthanasia for?
Yes, there was a big case in Holland where a patient who had made what unfortunately was a slightly vague and ambiguous advanced direction was euthanized by her doctor. And I think in Holland, you have to report all cases anyway to the central body. And either she asked for the case to be adjudicated or the official body asked for it to be adjudicated. And only, I think earlier this year, she was found not guilty of having done anything the wrong way. It was a bit unfortunate, but it was mainly a technical error. She decided that the woman had got to the stage where that she would have wanted euthanasia according to her advanced directive. But and the normal thing to do was to give people a sedative, an oral, something in their drink, so that they would sleep, and then they could be given a lethal injection. Unfortunately, they don't seem to have given her enough sedative. So she woke up in the middle of this, was naturally a bit confused, and had to be held down in some way, and that didn't look good. But I think it was merely a practical, technical issue and not actually a moral or ethical one. But there's a right and wrong. It's like giving someone a rather inadequate anesthetic in a way.
And the courts upheld that euthanasia.
The courts upheld that,
right.
And certainly you can do that in Belgium. I don't know much about Luxembourg, but I think it's a tiny country, and I think it's essentially follows Belgium.
Yeah, we don't hear much about that, but
no.
Yeah, I just wondered if we could. This is off the subject, but our November 22nd meeting, which I hope you'll participate in,
Yeah, sure.
is about death and dementia.
You are having a meeting tomorrow, is that right as well?
No,
You're not? I got that
I'm
confused.
sorry, that was confusing. No, November 22nd. And I was hoping to find a doctor from specifically Belgium, because they've had the law the longest, I think, longer than
have you
Holland.
got contacts there? Would you like me to try and find one for you?
Yes, that would be great. I'm also asking around
Mm.
my limited resources, but yeah.
I hope I'll be able to take part. I'm hoping to travel to our house in Spain on the 18th of November, but I think we'll be there by about the 21st. I'm sure we'll be there by the, I'll make sure that we get there by the evening of the 22nd.
Yeah, let me know where you are. Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, to talk about your organization now that used to be Old Age Rational Suicide.
Society for Old Age Rational Suicide. Well, that was founded by Michael Irwin,
right,
who, like me, used to be on the committee of the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, the oldest one in the world, founded in 1935.
Now called something much more conservative.
And he was chairman for a while, and then everyone has to retire eventually, and the Voluntary Euthanasia Society was taken over, was renamed Dignity in Dying in about 2000, and they also, without consulting the membership at all, changed its aims from a Belgian or Dutch style legislation, which applied to anyone with an intolerable quality of life and no possible treatment, to an Oregon style 6-month limit, because they thought that would be much easier to get through Parliament. So I can understand why they do it, but many people think that it was wrong. And they've absolutely refused to let it be discussed in the society. So Michael formed a breakaway group in about 2009 called, a bit of a mouthful, the Society for Old Age Rational Suicide.
Which is a really very specific goal there, yeah.
But basically it included people who had lived a completed life, as the phrase is, and could only see further gradual steady decline all the way, and they wanted to quit while they were ahead. But of course it also included people with progressive neurological disease and people with terminal illness. But it was specifically designed to concentrate on the problem of an unhappy old age with lots of illnesses. And that gradually, slowly grew in numbers, and it was decided it would be better renamed. We had a lot of discussion about what to call it. Eventually we ended up with My Death, My Decision. And I think we are within striking distance of actually becoming the main British organization, because when is this going out on, when is this discussion going to be made public?
November 22nd, it's live.
Right. Well, I think I can tell you. If not, I'll ask you to cut it out. But within the next few weeks, it will be announced that the Welsh branch of Dignity in Dying has mutinied. It has seceded from Dignity in Dying and is joining us.
All right.
That is a massive event, and I have just today written to the British Medical Journal asking them if they would like an exclusive. And I'm fairly sure that by in a month's time, that will be a big news item. If it isn't, I'll let you know, and you better excite me, because
I'm not so sure it's such an explosive item in the United States, but congratulations.
Yeah. So, they have joined us because they don't agree with Dignity in Dying's very limited aim. And we also had a vote by the British Medical Association, which is rather like the American Medical Association. And slightly to our surprise, they not only voted by a significant majority not to oppose assisted dying, which they had not done before. But most of them actually supported a Dutch or Canadian style legislation that was not restricted to 6 months. It didn't mention terminal illness, actually. So most of them actually support MDMD's view rather than dignity in dying, which is a great embarrassment to dignity in dying.
Is that public, the British Medical Association position on that?
Yes, it's well.
I know they're neutral now, but
that is the result of the poll. They have not. They won't be actually discussing it until next year. But the results of the poll would make it very difficult for them not to adopt at least a neutral position, which we'd be quite happy with. And it's possible that by then they might adopt one that actually positively supports it, as most of their patients do. So a lot of exciting things are happening in Britain at the moment, and it's an interesting time to be around.
Well, that's what's interesting about this movement, is because there has been progress, incremental, of course, but important, so that we now are in a much better situation than we were 30 years ago. Maybe.
Is there any chance of a change in California's laws to make it more inclusive?
I doubt it.
Not even in California? Not
even in California. I would say no. But that's what Final Exit Network has sort of taken up the slack and become an organization that most people, many people can go to instead of relying on the Oregon model that we have in California, which has worked very well within the restrictions that it has. If you can find a doctor who will do it.
Always struck me as rather odd that in America, where you have a homicide rate several times ours, and where people go around blasting their heads off with guns all the time, and you have a suicide rate that's twice ours, and yet everyone gets so uptight about a relatively small number of people wanting to have a civilized death.
Well, as you said before, we're a very religiously based country, and that does make it difficult. And I'm worried about our Supreme Court now, reversing all the progress we've made so far. So.
Oh, did you have a chance to look at my killer argument against the anti-abortionists that I sent you?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, I sent it as an attachment to a last email. If you haven't got it,
no, send it. Okay. But I do like your proposition that you make in the book about communities for supporting people who want to continue living and supporting people who want to die. That was an interesting proposition.
Yes, I think several people have had the idea. Michael Owen said that he had suggested that the Voluntary Euthanasia Society should actually try and sponsor some kind of hospice for people who preferred to die sooner rather than later. It would have been rather difficult, but I think it's something that needs talking about, because I'm all in favor of choice. If people want to stay alive, provided a society feels it can afford it in a state-sponsored health service, then they should stay alive. Even though I am not at all religious, it's like most secularists, it's not part of my job to tell religious people what they ought to believe. I just don't want them to tell me what I ought to believe. And so we all ought to be able to have our own philosophy as much as possible, and to live and die in the way that we want, which inevitably is going to differ.
For people who do keep on living, we can just keep on keeping on, throwing vast amounts of medication and money at people who are long past caring whether they live or die, who cannot even understand the concept of mortality, whose lives are either empty or full of discomfort, fear, and confusion. I think that's really very good.
Well, I'm afraid that's an accurate description of how an awful lot of people die once they have dementia.
That's right. And so choice is very nice once people realize that this is what's going to happen to them.
Yeah.
But most people don't. They just fade into doing nothing, into one stage to the next, until they are at the stage that you described. And you also quote, well, this is your quote, I guess, that life is not always wonderful, and not all things in it are bright and beautiful. So important for people to know that. So I appreciate that point of view in here. It's above the clinical point of view, and it's telling people really what could happen to them.
No, I think people, one mustn't exaggerate it one way or another, but I think people have a right to know what dementia is like. And awful, as I mentioned in the book, if you go to the website of anything like the Alzheimer's Society, it's always full of smiling people.
No, that was a very good point you made.
You never see people screaming in bed. You never see people with bed sores. You never see people who are incontinent. You never see people who need to be restrained, who are being force-fed, who say, why is this happening to me? Let me die. They scrub these things out. I've sent my book, or at least I've offered to send it to the Alzheimer's Society for a review, and I never even got a reply.
They don't like to talk about this.
No.
I don't quite understand it, but that's right. I mean, they do wonderful work, and I think it's great, and the research is wonderful, and caring for the caregivers is wonderful. Everything is wonderful, but inevitably, this is not a wonderful disease. So,
no. And we have very little prospect, I think, of any breakthrough in treatment. And like any treatment, it will need to be carefully studied and trialed for several years before it can be regarded as safe.
One thing that we're talking about, that a lot of people are talking about, is an advanced directive that says for VSED, once you're incompetent, lack capacity to stop eating and drinking, to make sure that that's what happens to you. Yeah. And right now, that's not what happens to you. You get the spoon put to the mouth opens, and you continue to live.
Well, I think it is possible in most legislations to make an advance decision that says, if I do not request food, you must not feed me. I think
it's possible to make the request, but it's not possible to make sure it's honored. So Final Exit Network is going ahead with that proposition, and anybody who fills out their form whose wishes are not being honored, they will take to court, because it does require finally a judicial decision about whether an institution can do this or not, because many institutions feel they cannot stop providing food.
Yeah, well, I don't know how common it is in America, but people with advanced dementia are still getting feeding tubes.
Oh no, no, I don't think that's common here. That's horrible.
If they're not eating, because it's much quicker to pump a syringe full of gunge down a tube than to sit there, a nurse to sit there for half an hour trying to feed someone who doesn't want to be fed. So I think it's less common than it used to be, but it seems from the papers I've read to be still quite common.
Well, we're going to be talking about that November 22nd, and the attorney for Final Exit Network will be talking about the chances of getting that through the courts, and I think they're good.
With any luck, you might have a new president by then.
And if we don't, we're really in bad shape here, because a lot of this legislation that we've accomplished over the past 40 years could go down the tubes.
Really? I mean, even things like the Oregon Act could be repealed?
It could be, and the living will could be repealed. And VSED, I don't know, VSED could be criminalized. Who knows?
Right.
When you have a very pro-life Supreme Court, it's going to be very tricky to maintain the progress we've made.
The Vatican strikes again after all these years.
We have 6 Catholic justices on the Supreme Court now. Oh, we will have. Colin, I'm going to stop this interview, and I just want to make sure that your book is plugged. It's available on Amazon. I highly recommend.
It may not be available in hardback for a while. In printed form for a while, but it's certainly on Kindle.
This is paperback.
If anyone has a problem getting it desperately wants a printed edition and can't get one, I've got a few at home, and I can post them or get. I think there's one bookshop still has some, but my publisher unfortunately went out of action just about the time that his very small firm is incapacitated, and And so the firm has folded. So it's meant a great more copies.
Okay, well, it's very nice to talk to you. I hope we'll be talking again in November, where you'll be in Spain.